Let's go into our, there we go, here we go, all right. Well, we've done a lot of review over the past few weeks, so I want to go exactly where we are. I'd like to get forward so that we can eventually see the end of this series and move on to another one, although I'm enjoying our time here in this series. Here we see, of course, we're in the Ottoman Empire, not the Ottoman people who make cushions and hassocks, but the Turks who ruled over this area for 400 years. You can see that brown area, that's the Turkish Empire. We talked about the rise of Zionism. We talked about the fact that we have two eyewitness accounts of there being few and far between various different little miniature villages, and not a great population in that area. No matter what people want to claim today, it's simply not the case. Stories are stories. History is history. We talked about the 4 holy cities. This is the main areas of Jewish population in the region: Jerusalem, Hebron in the south, Tiberias and Sfad in the north. I want to remind you that in 1882, there were only 24,000 Jewish people in the entirety of the land. But as the 20th century dawned, and that's where we left off last time, we have the population has arisen to 85,000, not simply because Jewish people were having babies. It had to do with immigration, right? As Jews fled persecution wherever they were coming from. We looked last week at Psalm 137, which goes back to the time of exile. It goes back to the 6th century. And the concern of the heart of the Jewish people, that they could not possibly forget not only their promise, the promised land, the land of promise, the holy city of Jerusalem where the temple stood, but that Jerusalem is the tops above my chief joy, and the hope of returning to Israel. The hope of once again being able to pray in Jerusalem is the greatest hope, characterizing a people literally dispersed around the world. Again, there's still a remnant who lived in Israel. There's always been a remnant, a Jewish presence in Israel. But nonetheless, the vast majority, by the 19th century, by the 20th century, they were outside of the land of Israel. But for 1900 years, this hope, this identification with the land has maintained Jewish identity no matter where they are. No other people group in the world can claim that level of continuance despite all odds. Well, we have an individual by the name of Blackstone, about 1850, 1860. He's very famous in the region of law. Everybody knows Blackstone's commentaries on the law. They were studied for a long time. I think they still are. I'm not sure if they still are. Nonetheless, he's a very influential evangelical, not Jewish, very influential evangelical. And he wrote, as the turn of the century dawns, turn of the 20th century dawns, he writes a memorial. And he writes to President Benjamin Harrison. Right? And he writes in favor, he is proposing to the President of the United States, he's proposing that the Jewish people be allowed to return to their homeland. He sees the persecution that Jewish people are experiencing around the world at the end of the 19th century. And so he writes, these are copies that are in the, I don't know where these came from, but I got them online. Why not give Palestine back to them again? If you're an evangelical, if you're a Bible reader, we all know avid Bible readers, they read not only the text in the books, but they turn to the maps in the back of the Bible, right? And so as you're studying the Bible, you're also studying the maps in the back of your Bible. And this area is called, in those Bible books, is called Palestine. So it's not surprising that he's calling for a return to Palestine as opposed to Judea or Israel. That's the name it's known by in the back of their Bible. But let us return them. So he attempts to begin a movement to get the Jewish people to return to their land. And it's signed by all manner of famous people, and it is sent out. He later on revises it, and he sends it again to Woodrow Wilson. Wilson becomes president in, 14? And he sends the letter out to Woodrow Wilson. Again, didn't work with Harrison. Let's send it out with Wilson. So, therefore, we, the undersigned, he writes, representative individuals, societies, organizations, and public officers in the United States most respectfully commend the memorial aforesaid in the attached letter of presentation and document attached pertaining thereto to the Honorable Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, and the officers of our government, for consideration of the action therein prayed and such measures as may be deemed wise and best for the permanent relief of the Jews. This is May 1916. So, this is a movement among Christian evangelicals that is arising separately but simultaneously with the movement of Zionism, which I haven't yet talked about, Zionism, which arises among the Jewish people of Europe. So you have two movements that are parallel, simultaneously beginning to arise, and you have a great call for the churches, evangelical churches, to move governments so that the Jewish people can have their own homeland. So you can call this Christian Zionism. While Christian Zionism is arising, and again, this is kicked off by William Blackstone, very famous lawyer, you have Jewish Zionism that is arising as well. Well, the Jewish people's ongoing dream to one day return to their God-given homeland continues. And as I mentioned, I believe last week, that throughout history, intermittent remnants of exiles, wherever they were, in North Africa, in Russia, the Pale of Settlement, in Europe, when they were presented with the opportunity, where they could actually travel, where they could actually go, many of them did return to their land. They tenaciously embraced their ancestral land, just as those who were present on the land embraced their heritage while experiencing discriminations and adversities. Nonetheless, the aspiration to once again live with a free and an autonomous Jewish nation, it never wavered. It never receded. Whether they were separated from the homeland, whether resident in the homeland, both communities successfully met the challenge of maintaining their Jewish identity. Though some may argue, there's a famous Jewish maxim, more than the Jews kept the Sabbath kept the Jews. And so the rabbi's argument is that, well, Jewish identity has always been kept by our keeping of traditions, particularly our weekly Sabbath observance. That is the key to understanding, perhaps so. I would argue that greater than Sabbath observance has been the identification of the people of God with the land that God gave his people, as revealed in the book that God gave his people. So Israel's God revealing Israel's land to Israel's people through Israel's book. Beginning of the 20th century, a time of great upheaval. And again, the best story that you can see to understand the upheaval is Fiddler on the Roof. I think is a terrific and entertaining summary of what's happening here during this turn of the century period of time. People from Eastern Europe, people from Russia are fleeing persecution, and many, of course, are coming to America. My family, at the dawn of the 20th century, in the first decade, come to America. Right? But many, instead of going west to America, they take the left turn at Albuquerque and go down to Palestine and join the burgeoning Jewish communities there. There's a lot of action. As you can see, we moved from 24,000 to 85,000 by the turn of the century. Now, how is this being facilitated? For the next 60 years, Jewish refugees are buying this, so the end of the 20th century, or end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish refugees are buying tracts of land in western Palestine. From whom are they purchasing these tracts of land? From Turkish owners and Arab owners, many of whom were absentee from the land that they owned. They were speculators. They lived elsewhere. And much of the land that was sold to the Jewish people was considered non-arable. It was worthless desert or malaria-infested swampland, which explains why those tracts of land were enthusiastically sold to the Jews, and they were sold at often vastly inflated prices. So you have the rise of Zionism, and Jewish people are beginning to return, and when they return, they're funded by wealthy Jewish families in Europe and are able to buy these large tracts of worthless land. However, the land becomes not worth less, but worth something through the blood, the sweat, and the toil of the Jewish pioneers. So what happens to land that is desert, non-arable? The Jewish people figure out, they innovate how to irrigate land that is dried up and make the desert bloom. What do you do with swampland? You drain the swampland and you create fertile, arable land. Of course, malaria is going to strike a lot of people. Remember where these people are coming from. They're little Jewish Nebushes, many of them, little nothings from Eastern Europe. All they know was ghetto and persecution. And they don't know anything from farming. And so they're figuring it out. They're learning as they go. And many of them die through their efforts. But nonetheless, the efforts are successful. Jumping ahead for a moment, by the time you get to the 1947 UN partition, which we'll talk about next week, the Jewish people owned legally procured deeds to almost 9% of Palestine. So let me say that again. Jumping ahead, you're going to see the United Nations partition the land of Palestine into an Arab region and a Jewish region. The Jewish people, by 1947, actually already owned, they had purchased, and they had toiled, and they had redeemed what was once worthless land is no longer worthless land, 9% of the land that the United Nations grants them, recognizes as the Jewish homeland. So out of 7,912 square miles, Palestine, they owned 687.5. They owned it. Remember, I made a big deal for weeks and weeks and weeks, just like Genesis does, of Abraham's owning the cave in Hebron, Machpelah. Right? The Bible makes a really big deal that while God has given this entire land to the Jewish people in perpetuity, that Abraham actually went out and bought this particular tract of land to bury as a family burial ground, where his wife was buried, where he's buried, where the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. So just as the Bible emphasizes, even though God gave it to you, you still have a legal right to it. Here's one little area that you have legal right to. The Jewish people took that, they multiplied that, and they owned 9%. So over time, and with considerable effort, the newly arrived immigrants actually did. They drained the swamps, they made the desert bloom. Now, what happens when the swamps are drained and the desert blooms leads to economic opportunities and a marked improvement over the region's quality of life. When that happens, when new regions become boom areas, economic opportunity, you're going to attract an influx of people from outside the land who see opportunity. And so you have Arab migrants and you have Bedouin migrants who are coming from eastern Palestine, from surrounding countries. You have Egyptians, and you have Turks, and you have Syrians, and Lebanese, and Greeks, and many other ethnicities coming to the land. Now, you have this fellow right here, Theodor Herzl. Who is Theodor Herzl? He is the intellectual giant and greatest activist for the Jewish cause. He grew up in Europe. And in Europe, and I'm going to have to end here, we'll continue with Theodor Herzl next week. But in Europe, there was something that was called the Haskalah, the Jewish Renaissance, the intellectual Renaissance, as the Jewish people began to be liberated from their ghetto lives, and they begin to be invited and integrated into European society. And for the first time in centuries, the Jewish people can leave the segregated ghettos behind if they want, and they can move into society. They can go to school. They can go to college. They can university. They can become professionals in European society. So in this great intellectual renaissance, this Haskalah, this is the great hope of the Jewish people. And, oh, well, now the Europeans will at long last accept us as equals and allow us to take our place. We'll no longer be on the bottom of the pecking order. We'll no longer be persecuted. We're in an enlightened age. The Haskalah is the Jewish Enlightenment. So we will be in this age of enlightenment, and everything will be hunky-dory for us. I don't know if you heard the story of Alfred Dreyfus and something called the Dreyfus Affair. Now, when I say the Dreyfus Affair, that actually sounds a lot more salacious and scintillating than it actually was. Alfred Dreyfus was a captain in the French army. And he was falsely accused of being a spy for the Russians. It was an instance of Russia, right? And he is a dupe of the Russians. It's history. History only has a certain number of themes, right? And patterns, and those patterns repeat and play, and variations play over. But anyway, Alfred Dreyfus, this French Jew, had risen to a level of prestige in military career, and he's accused falsely of being a Russian spy. And covering this trial, the Dreyfus Affair, the trial of the century, European trial of the century, was a reporter by the name of Theodore Herzl. That's this fellow with the delightful Smith Brothers type beard that we see. He's not a Smith Brothers. He doesn't sell cough drops. He's actually Theodore Herzl. He is the father of Zionism. He's covering this trial. And Dreyfus is found guilty. Theodore Herzl realizes Eureka, which is Hebrew, by the way, for Eureka. And he realizes that even with this Haskalah, this Jewish Enlightenment, this great movement, anti-Semitism is never going away. Jewish people are never going to truly be accepted into European society. And so he writes a book called the Judenstaat, which is a Jewish state, proposing that So while Blackstone has done his deal, and Blackstone's writing roughly contemporaneously in America, you have in Europe, Theodore Herzl is writing this book, A Jewish State, and what is going to happen? What influence will this book, Der Judenstaat, a Jewish state, have in igniting a Zionist movement, if any? What happens to Alfred Dreyfus, by the way? What is his fate, having been found guilty, having been railroaded under false pretenses as a Russian asset? I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you in suspense. We'll cover that next week. Let's stand for the Aaronic benediction.